The hallway smells faintly like old paper and floor polish. City Hall is never truly quiet. There's always a hum, phones ringing somewhere, shoes echoing against marble, the low murmur of conversations behind closed doors. Government has its own soundtrack, administrative and predictable. He knows this building. He's walked these halls many times before. But today, he doesn't use the front entrance. Instead, he slips in through a basement window. It's not dramatic, it's just practical. He doesn't want to set off the metal detectors. He doesn't want questions. He doesn't want pauses. He moves quickly, but not fast enough to look frantic. That would draw attention. In his pocket, a loaded revolver. Upstairs, George Moscone is working at his desk. Papers are stacked, decisions are pending, the kind of ordinary afternoon that doesn't know it's about to become history. Then he walks into Moscone's office. Moscone reiterates that Dan White can't have his job back. His resignation was binding. Dan can't control his rage. He lifts the gun and points it at Moscone. 4 shots. Moscone falls to the ground, unmoving. Dan turns on his heel and leaves. Then he hears a familiar voice. He reloads, marches up to the man who represents his hatred and disappointment. This time, he shoots 5 times. And now, Harvey Milk is dead. It's November 27th, 1978, and in less than 5 minutes, Dan White has changed San Francisco forever. You're listening to True Crime Culinary. I'm your host, Leah Jack. Let's sink our teeth into this story. Hi, and welcome. My name is Leah, and you are listening to True Crime Culinary, the show where we take a true crime story and pause to ask, hey, wait a second, where did that come from? But we focus on the food, because sometimes food isn't the crime, it's part of the fabric that holds a scene together. It gives context, and it tells us how people cope. And honestly, my week has been kind of intense. I did go to the Bad Bunny concert and felt so much pride seeing my Salvadoran culture and language on a massive stage, even just for a little bit. I'm in peak student mode with a million things due. Work's been kind of a bummer. And then there are the Olympics, which, I mean, how do you not get sucked in? Hello? Did you see the cross-country skier casually flying uphill at a sub-6-minute mile? I have so many questions. Meanwhile, I'm over here eating sweets and multi-flavored cup of noodles, and I was at a friend's house who was hosting the cup of noodle amazingness, and he had a Twinkie cookbook, which I short-circuited a little bit, but then I kind of was like, wait a second, I have an entire podcast that I've dedicated to figuring out the origin of crazy stuff, so I gotta look at some Twinkies. And then I remembered that there is a story very relevant to the city I call home that also includes the word Twinkies. And so it begins. We go back to the scene. 5 minutes after Dan White has done lost his shit, he calls his wife, gets into a car, and drives to a church. And I can't stop thinking about the drive. Like, what must his wife have been thinking? Like, oh, okay. Hey, so where's that gun that you mentioned? But fortunately, he turns himself in. Now let's take a closer look at Dan White. He was a former soldier, police officer, and firefighter. By most accounts, he had been dependable, stable, and conservative. Very openly anti-gay, which had to be intense considering he worked alongside Harvey Milk at a moment when San Francisco, a city they'd both been elected to govern, had become an LGBTQ stronghold. In the months leading up to the murders, something shifted. He resigned from the board of supervisors, then tried to reclaim his seat, and for a while it looked like he might actually be reappointed. But in the end, Moscone said no. And then friends noticed changes. Dan seemed withdrawn, angrier and less steady. He stopped working out. He stopped eating the way he used to. And as someone who is trained in psychology, like, red flags everywhere. When people abandon long-standing routines without an obvious physical reason, such as like a broken leg, it usually means something is unraveling. We are remarkably consistent creatures. So when sleep changes, appetite changes, movement disappears, that often signals like heavy distress. And we've probably all been there. When you start to get in these like shame spirals, anxious kind of vortexes, or you're just stuck thinking about something, you really start to get more and more stressed. And your suffering is immense because you just can't seem to find your normal. And this was also late 70s, where mental health support wasn't exactly the most popular avenue. So I can't help but think that he probably didn't reach for a therapist, and instead he reached for sugar, which unfortunately, it sounds like he was having major sleep issues, which is very common with depression, that usually people notice that they start sleeping a lot more or a lot less, or like the quality of sleep is much worse. And famously, sugar isn't typically something you would prescribe to somebody to improve their sleep. And yet, when you get stressed, you tend to crave sweets. So he's just in some sort of spiral before he's even gotten to City Hall. And then now he's really up shit creek and has made some very bad decisions that have huge impacts to the community. So let's cut to 1979. The courtroom is packed. Milk supporters, Moscone supporters, journalists, and protesters abound. White's defense, his legal defense, doesn't argue that Twinkies caused murder. Instead, they take the only legal route viable to them, which is diminished capacity. They argue that Dan White was severely depressed, not sleeping, emotionally unraveling, and that his sudden dependence on junk food was a symptom of that collapse. Not a cause, but evidence. Evidence that something in him had broken. Not that sugar made him violent, but that his judgment was impaired, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that he wasn't fully himself. The junk food isn't framed as fuel for violence, it's framed as proof that his mental state has deteriorated. But the defense sounds strange to people, almost surreal. And I keep saying defense, I meant defense. Anyway, and reporters latch onto the most headline-friendly detail, which is the Twinkies. They start calling it the Twinkie Defense. It's not a real legal doctrine, it's just a nickname that basically represents a really strange and kind of like lacking in real legal quality defense, but the name sticks. Thus, we must go back in time and figure out where doth Twinkies come frometh. They were introduced in 1930 by the Continental Baking Company under the Hostess brand. They were invented on April 6th, 1930 by Canadian-born baker James Jimmy Dewar. He's a doer. He likes to do stuff. Anyway, the origin story is actually kind of brilliant. The bakery had shortcake molds that were only being used during strawberry season. So Dewar looked at the empty pans and thought, what else can I put in here? And instead of strawberries, he piped in cream. Did you know that originally Twinkies were filled with banana cream? Yes, I speak the truth. It was. The OG flav was banana. But then during World War II, bananas were rationed, so the company switched to vanilla, and it stuck. The name Twinkie supposedly came from a nearby billboard advertising twinkle toe shoes. Super simple, super accidental, and super iconic. And this iconic treat is V-popular. Cheap, portable, comforting, very Depression-era practical. But I am sad to report, not indestructible. I too once believed Twinkies could survive the apocalypse. Twinkies have been featured in many a movie. Some of you might think Ghostbusters, some of you might think Die Hard, I think WALL-E, where the Twinkie is featured and kind of like supposedly indestructible because the little cockroach kind of burrows in there, hundreds of years, we later find out after humans left Earth. In reality, I read that I think they last like 7 to 10 days. Like it's a days thing, not a years or millennia, which honestly makes them a little more human. So back to the company though, Hostess, the company behind Twinkies, had its own roller coaster. Years of debt, labor disputes, executive pay controversy, and 2 bankruptcies eventually led to a temporary shutdown in 2012. About 18,000 workers lost their jobs. And then the Twinkie disappeared, very briefly, because people absolutely lost their vanilla-flavored shit. There was resale markups, hoarding, dramatic headlines, and then, like any good American resurrection story, they came back because we said, give it to us. Now, Twinkies live in this strange cultural space. They're part nostalgia, part novelty. There's a Twinkie sushi, Twinkies paired with savory foods, and of course, the deep-fried Twinkie at state fairs, which is a Twinkie dipped in batter and fried until the cream, I read the words, liquefies and is absorbed back into the cake. I haven't tried that. I must admit I am a bit intrigued but also alarmed by the concept of liquefaction. So I promise next time I go to a state fair I'm going to try it, but I must just point out that the description is a bit on the alarming side of the spectrum. So now back to the courtroom. The jury ultimately returns a verdict of voluntary manslaughter. Dan White is sentenced to just over 7 years. Yep, just 7. And he is paroled after 5. Later, he dies by suicide, and not much longer after he's paroled. I think I read like a year or two. And honestly, I think this was a person who desperately needed mental health support long before anyone was hurt. I also think the Twinkie defense, or at least the way it was framed and received, got in the way of justice for Moscone and Milk. These were 2 men who meant a lot to San Francisco. 2 lives reduced to a legal technicality and a punchline. Harvey Milk, an openly gay elected official, insisted that queer people deserved protection, dignity, and political power. He pushed for anti-discrimination laws. He built coalitions. He made it harder for the city to pretend LGBTQ communities didn't exist. And for me, we're all people who deserve to be seen, loved, and equally represented. We have to evolve, we have to adapt, and we have to recognize change. What I love about the origin story of Twinkies is how simple it is. Someone looked at an empty cake mold when strawberries were out of season and thought, what else can I make? That tiny amount of creativity turned into an American icon. And P.S., I checked, you can find Twinkies all over the world, but arguably they are very much an American icon. But that to me is what's so interesting about learning about food history and tying it to different true crimes, just kind of as like the vector for discovery. Admittedly, I thought Twinkies were just kind of like shitty snacks. I didn't understand how much ingenuity, how much creativity went into their kind of their creation story, how much flavors changed and were influenced by environmental factors like World War II. I used to think Twinkies lacked substance, and the fact that the Twinkie defense basically means there's lacking substance, and yet Twinkies and the Twinkie defense represent nothing but substance. The Twinkie defense itself kind of represents this moment in time where there's a certain amount of injustice that has been doled out to everybody, right? Like Moscone and Milk did not get justice. This guy did not get justice, and I'm not suggesting that he's the victim here. I think he is a victim. And so all I can say is if you are feeling in any way shitty like this, if you're noticing patterns about this, you're not alone. There is help, and go seek it. I am somebody who is a huge advocate for mental health support. I would have died probably had I not gotten mental health support. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.